For the first challenge question, you're given a code listing that has two classes defined, a cat class and a dog class, and a main function down at the bottom. And your task is to try and produce an environment diagram given this code listing, and then respond to the questions on Gradescope about this particular problem. If you haven't already paused the video, I would encourage you to do so while you're working through this diagram and going ahead and responding to the questions on Gradescope. All right, let's trace through this together. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my globals frame. And in this particular code listing, there aren't any global variables that we're particularly concerned about. So that will remain empty. I'm going to go ahead and set up my heap, and this will be where our objects are located. And this program begins in the main function. The return address where this main function was encountered was down on line 33. So that's where we'll go back to once we're done and the program completes. And we jump into main, right? So main doesn't have any parameters for us to set up. And now we're about to evaluate this very first line. This very first line brings us to one of the concepts that we're focused on this unit, right? So here we're seeing the new keyword, which is your hint that we're about to do something to create a new object on the heap. And what we're talking about creating a new instance of is a dog object, right? So this dog object will be derived from this dog class that we're seeing here. We see that a parameter is being passed to the constructor of this dog class. So remember, when you see a new keyword followed by a class name, and you look in that class and you see that there's a constructor defined, this is going to be a special function that runs in the process of setting up this object. So first, we're going to take a look at how do we set up a constructor. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and set up my dog object on the heap. We see that dog has a name property associated with it. And initially that name property is uninitialized. So this is how we're going to set up our initial dog object. And then what we're going to do is set up a frame for the constructor, right? So new followed by a class name is going to be a call to the dog constructor. And if you want to shorthand this with just cons, that's fine. For the purposes of this video, I'll write it out constructor, right? To set up a constructor, we need to pass in our parameters just like any other function call. And so here we have a name parameter, right, that needs to be established. And the name that we're passing is the string Chester. And we know that our return address, the return value of this will be line 28. That's where this constructor call was originated. And then the last thing that we need to set up as we're establishing this constructor's frame is what is the this variable, right? And so this is going to refer to the new object that's being constructed. Remember, this is a special property of a constructor. When a constructor frame is established, this will refer to the new object that we're constructing. So we jump in and we see that this is a common pattern with constructors, right? We take one of these parameters and we assign that parameter's value to some property of our object. So we're saying take name, which is the string Chester, and assign it to this dot. So we look at this, and remember dot is saying we're following this reference to the object that we're talking about here. And so this dot name is going to be assigned Chester. And so I'm going to fill in the string Chester here. Needed to make a little bit more space for that. All right. So we finished this constructor, and one of the special properties of a constructor, remember, is that just before a constructor returns, there's this implicit return statement. So every constructor, the purpose of a constructor is to return this. You're never going to see this line of code, but every constructor will always have a return value of whatever reference this is, right? So our return value here is going to be a reference to this dog object that we just established, right? So where are we returning that reference to? Well, we're returning it back to the point at which that constructor was called on line 28. And so here in main, we're going to have a variable named Alex established now. And Alex will now be a reference to this dog object, right? A very similar process is going to happen with the next line of code. So here we see that we're creating a new cat object, right? So we have to look and see, hey, do we have a class named cat, and does it have a constructor that takes a single string parameter? And sure enough, we do, right? So what we're going to need to do is the same set of steps where we can set up a frame for the cat constructor. And the return address here is going to be line 29. And our name parameter will be boots. Right? And then this is going to be a reference to the cat object that we're constructing. And so we set up our cat object whose name is currently undefined, right? So we don't have a name established yet for this object that's being set up, right? Because we haven't yet jumped into this constructor. We've now set up the frame to process this constructor's code, which we know is up here. And we have an object that we can work with that is assigned to the this variable automatically, right? So we jump to line 7 and notice that we're jumping to a different place. Even though these two things are the same, if we had different code for cat, because we are constructing a cat object, whatever is in its constructor would have been evaluated. It just so happens to be that these two constructors have the same code in them, right? And so we take the name value, and once again, we're assigning this.name. So this, we follow the reference. The name property of that object is being assigned whatever the name value was in the frame of the constructor, and that will be boots. Right? Once again, we reach that implicit return. So the return value of this constructor is going to be a reference to that exact same cat object, right? So now we have this cat reference being returned back to line 29. So line 29 is all the way down here, and we're setting up a variable named Fido. And Fido refers to this cat object, right? Because we returned a reference to that cat object, Fido will now reference it. And I want to point out that you'll notice that the code listing, the variable names we chose here, Fido is referring to a cat, is kind of poorly named to try and make this tracing of this exercise a little bit more interesting, right? Remember, these variable names of main are not really associated with they're independent of the properties, the name property of each of these two objects, right? So now we're at line 30, and finally we reach the other big idea of this unit, right? So this unit is about two things primarily that are really big and important. The first are constructors that make it easier for us to set up new objects. And the second is methods. And so a method is a special kind of function that's defined on a class, and every object of that class then has that function. So there's an interesting thing happening here that we haven't really addressed head on in class yet, which is when we call a speak method, how do we know which speak we are going to evaluate? So notice the speak methods are different. The speak method of cat says meow, my name is, followed by the name. And the speak method of the dog will say woof, I'm, followed by the dog's name, right? So when we encounter a method call, an important step that we need to take is we need to say, okay, well, first of all, is the thing that we're calling the method on actually an object? So remember, the way that we can determine that this is a method call is we see some name of something followed by a dot, and then what looks like a function call after it. So it's the name of a method followed by some parentheses, and we can have arguments in those parentheses. And so in this case, we see Alex. So we would look in the main frame, right? This is where we're evaluating this code in mains frame. So we look at Alex, and we see that Alex refers to a dog object. So now that we know that we're dealing with a dog object, we look and we see, okay, does the dog object have a speak method? And sure enough, it does. So we can set up a frame for it, dog speak, and the return address is going to be line 30. There are no parameters to pass, but we do need to set up the this variable. So what will this be? And I'm going to actually change colors real quick because I think it'll be important to illustrate this. So I'm going to change to blue here. And this, which blue shows up very poorly on this black. I apologize for that. If we look at line 30, this is going to be Alex, whatever Alex refers to in main. So Alex is this reference in main, which means that when we call this particular method, this is also going to refer to that exact same dog object, right? So when we set up the frame for a method call, the word that comes before the dot, or the name that comes before the dot, is the reference we'll use to establish the this variable in the method's frame, right? So now we jump into this particular frame, and here we print woof, I'm followed by this dot name. And so my output is going to be woof, I'm, and then we're concatenating this dot name. So this, we follow that reference, and then we look at the name property is going to be Chester, right? At the end of a method call that's void, we return nothing. So my return value is going to be nothing. And we would jump back to where we came from, which was line 30, and we've just completed line 30. We're now ready to process line 31. Very similar set of steps here, but we have to be very careful, right? So alex.speak was a call to dog's speak method. And here we're setting up a call to fido.speak. So we look at, okay, well in main, what is Fido? Fido is a reference to this cat object. So we look in the cat class and we see, do you have a speak method? And sure enough, the cat class does have a speak method. So we are going to set up a call to cat's speak method, right? So when we set up a frame for a method call, we put the class name first, followed by the method name. And here you can kind of start to see, why is it we do that? Well, we can have a speak method that's specific to dog objects and one that's specific to cat objects, all right? So we've got our cat speak method. The return address is line 31. And we set up a this variable. And so what is this going to be? Well, again, the this variable in a method call is whatever came before the dot that led to that method call. It's like we're trying to address this method call to some specific object. And so Fido was a reference to this cat named Boots. And so this will also be a reference to that particular cat object, right? So we've set up our frame and we're ready to jump into cat's speak method. So this is where we jump. And so notice now we're going to print something different because we called the speak method of a cat object versus a dog object. And we can say the output would be meow, my name is, and then we would say this dot name in Boots, right? When we reach the end of that method call, it's a void method. So our return value would be nothing. And we would go back to main and we would reach the end of the main function and we would have nothing there, right? And so this would be the diagram we would have produced. The key concept of this particular challenge problem is recognizing that when we have multiple classes in our program, each is going to have their specific constructor code evaluated when we construct new objects. And then if they just so happen to have methods of the same name, we need to be very careful to be sure we know which method is being called on a given object.